Thank you, Amrita. Is the mic okay here? Am I too close to this one? Should I move it away? Right there's fine? Okay, terrific. So I'm here to talk to you, and I'm going to walk and talk a little bit because I always have that little nervous energy. And it keeps you guys awake. That's what I do at my students too. So I'm not going to talk to you about what happens internally, whether you're cost competitive, what your quality is, what your value proposition is. You know that better than I do. Instead, what I'm going to talk about is the larger context of, as these business decisions get made, doing offshoring versus domestic sourcing, what are the larger impacts on the American economy around American workers, and then also what's the policy, public discussion around whether it matters or not, as well as the sort of the different conversation that's going on in manufacturing versus on the services side and the IT side. So I like to start my talks out on this topic with this cover of Business Week magazine. So this is from February 6, 2003. And I like to show this for a couple of reasons. First, you see this gentleman here, clearly in a suit, right, a white-collar worker hanging on for dear life as his job is being shipped offshore. And this was the sort of kick-started the public debate and public discussion about white-collar offshoring. We had a long discussion and conversation about blue-collar offshoring, manufacturing offshoring in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s. But this was the first sort of discussion and recognition that white-collar jobs could also go offshore. And to point out that we've had this now public discussion for 10 years, right? This is from February 2003. It's 2013 now. And what I would argue is that there really hasn't been much of a public policy response, okay? Even though it's gotten a lot of attention, a lot of discussion, probably amongst you, even on the kitchen table. It's even gotten some discussion in Washington, but really there hasn't been a significant public policy response. And I'll talk a little bit more about why I think that is. And the second is this right here. I think they ask the right question. Can America lose these jobs and still prosper? The reality is that America is and will lose some of these jobs. Whether we prosper really depends on what our responses are. So I said there's not much in the way of public policy response. There's been a lot of response on the private side, right? Where individuals are making decisions about what to study in college. Businesses are making investment choices. Economic development organizations are making bets on what they think is going to be geographically sticky and whatnot. So it's not as though this round of globalization hasn't had any effects. It's just there hasn't been a public policy response. Okay. So I want to start out with some of the impacts of offshoring. The first thing that's really important to talk about is the fact that offshoring is not the same thing as trade. Okay? And when economists talk about trade, they say this has been settled theory and empirics for a couple of centuries now. David Ricardo with the famous wine and wool example of Portugal and England. But what I would argue is that, in fact, offshoring is not the same thing as trade. In fact, it is trade plus shift in productive capabilities. And the economists have been having this debate and discussion for some time. I'd point you to Ralph Gomery's work with Will Baumol or Paul Samuelson. There was an article, the late Paul Samuelson, the Nobel Prize winner. There's a very nice New York Times article from, I think, 2004. Steve Lohr did it, talking about what the difference between offshoring and trade is. The bottom line is that comparative advantage in those discussions really don't apply. The reality is that offshoring can make America a net loser. So the typical story on comparative advantage in trade is, look, there's going to be winners and losers, right? Some people will get displaced and lose their jobs. Some companies will lose based on competition. But the gains we have in terms of lower costs and variety and all of those things will be larger than the losses. So the winners will gain more than what the losers lose, and we can pay off then, the winners could pay off theoretically the losers, and the U.S. will be better off net. But in terms of offshoring, the reality is that, in fact, the U.S. could be a net loser. Not only are there winners and losers, but the U.S. overall can be a net loser. And I'll explain why I think that white-collar offshoring is actually a bigger threat. Because I think it threatens higher wage jobs than we had during the blue-collar offshoring, and then I think there's some threats in terms of innovation and job creation. So I think what I would say is that we should be worried about this, right? It shouldn't be don't worry, be happy, which, by the way, is really the consensus in Washington amongst the elites. Okay. So some of the impacts, one of the predicted impacts here is based on an assumption that's made about trade and offshoring, and that is that we're at full employment in the U.S. So we should be at 4.5 or 5% unemployment. Basically what they argue is that when people lose, when they get displaced, they get reabsorbed into the labor market and fairly quickly. What you see in terms of the actual empirics, and this is directly from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Displaced Workers Survey, is that over this period of time, 2009 to 2011, by this date, 2012, 44% of the people who were displaced, not for offshoring, but for all reasons, because we don't track offshoring displacement, remained unemployed, and 54% who got jobs took pay cuts. So clearly there's a concentration of losses, right? When you lose your job, getting reabsorbed into the labor market is painful, right? You lose there. But what the economists would argue, and most people argue, is that, look, we're going to be at full employment, and really all this does is it changes the mix of U.S. occupations, it changes the mix of U.S. industries, okay? And so that's where they start in terms of the assumption. Now, the problem with that assumption is that there's no guarantee that the new occupations that will be created and the new industries that we retain or we create are going to be better than the ones we lose, and that's an important distinction. Okay, so this would be kind of the ideal scenario. Before offshoring, U.S. workers are doing, let's say, occupations A, B, and C. Let's call A, computer programming, B, engineering design, C, nursing. And then and offshore workers are idle. After offshoring, U.S. workers would be doing some of engineering design. Offshore workers picked off some of the computer programming and some of the engineering design. We retain in the U.S. nursing. And then those guys that got displaced move on to new occupation D. Now the hope, and this is only a hope, is that new occupation D is nanotechnology and not retail, right? That those jobs that are going to be created are actually better. And this is just an assumption, right? That's being made about what these effects are going to be. And so really what happens is what you care about is what does this new mix look like? In terms of occupations, right? Are these high-wage jobs? Do they give you career ladders? As well as good industries, right? I'd also point out that there's a lot of unpredicted and unpredictable impacts. For example, economic theory doesn't account for technological innovation. If you read the literature on the role of innovation in economic growth, it's usually set up as a residual. What's a residual? Well, it's what we can't explain, right? It's what's left over. And so we actually can't measure the direct impacts of innovation on economic growth, but we know it matters a lot. And so these models that we have about the effects of trade don't take this into account. And of course, national security is a very important one. And this was part of the discussion in the 1980s about why the semiconductor industry mattered so much, okay? And you had the semiconductor CEOs, whether it was Bob Noyce, Gordon Moore from Intel, they went to Washington. They didn't preach offshoring and free trade and free markets. They preached actually protection. And the arguments they made were around national security, and that this mattered a lot because of national security concerns. And as a result, there was a response in the 80s, and that was the creation of something called Semitech. So DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, actually subsidized the semiconductor industry about $500 million a year in order to keep that work here. Okay, so is offshoring a good thing, a bad thing? The U.S. and developing countries, the destination of these jobs, both gain and lose from offshoring. Okay? The net effects are really impossible to determine. So the point here is that the theory doesn't tell you what the actual outcome will be. Okay? We can get a sense of things, but it really depends on the empirics. It depends on what goes offshore and what remains sticky here in the U.S. to know what the actual net effects are going to be on the U.S. We also know that there's a distributional impact. Okay, so there's kind of two competing theories right now about what the impacts are, what types of jobs will stay, what types of industries will stay, and which ones will go. So one of them, which I think is really kind of the consensus one within Washington, and one I don't think is right, and that's the division of labor by skill level. So the notion that we're just going to offshore the low-level, labor-intensive kind of work that doesn't require high skills, creative kinds of things, and that the U.S. will retain and become kind of the creative, innovative, high-level, high-skill destination, right? And we'll keep those kinds of jobs. And I like to use the Apple iPad as an analogy there. If you look at the back of an Apple iPad, it says what? Designed in Cupertino, right? Made in China. So this notion of this division of labor, that the high-level creative design stuff will be sticky here, and the stuff that actually Foxconn does in terms of assembly and other kinds of manufacturing is what's going to go and be leaky, right? And so your competitive advantage is what? In innovation, right? And so you hear policymakers and politicians, and not just those folks, but academics and opinion makers and whatnot say what? The response is what? We need to move upskill and move to better industries. And so the answer is pretty straightforward. Let's just invest more in advanced education, more in R&D, and we'll be the innovation hub, right? And that's what we'll keep, and that's what we should concentrate our scarce resources in terms of investments on. Now, of course, many people in this room know that, in fact, there's some high-level stuff that is going offshore, right? The other theory, so that was the one theory which is kind of the consensus default theory. The other one is a division of labor instead of on skill level, but based on tradability. And Alan Blinder, who's a professor at Princeton University, former vice chair of the Federal Reserve, has really been kind of the popularizer of this notion. And he did a couple of empirical studies, not based on actual data, but based on his speculation of what types of jobs would go and stay. And his speculation, really, his theory and model, is based on the notion that anything that can be done remotely, meaning you don't need face-to-face interaction, is vulnerable to being offshored, right? So if you can do it in San Francisco servicing a client in New York, why can't you do that in the Philippines, right, is his argument. And so what he did was he went through all 838 standard occupation codes in the Bureau of Labor Statistics and said and he read the tasks that barbers do, as well as electronics engineers and so on and so forth, and he came up with a scale of whether you could do it remotely or not, and then he equated that scale to basically a vulnerability for offshoring. Could you codify it? Could you do it remotely? And those kinds of things. And what he found was kind of frightening, that about a third of all U.S. jobs are potentially vulnerable to offshoring. The second thing he found was that, in fact, education doesn't make one immune. So he did a very simple correlation, right? He said, okay, let me rank order all of these, the vulnerability, and you can look at the scale, and he said, what's the education required for each of these occupations? Is it really higher level that makes one more likely to be sticky rather than vulnerable? And it turns out there is no correlation, right? So barbers and surgeons, right, two ends, well, depending on how you view skills, are going to be sticky, but computer programming, engineering, design, accounting could be vulnerable because you do it remotely. The other thing he found was that most high-tech occupations are vulnerable based on his metric here. And his argument would be then that the solutions, rather than just try to invest in advanced education, is really to specialize and invest our scarce resources on the jobs and industries that are going to be sticky, the ones that require geographic proximity. And so let's put the money in there. Here, you got to ask, will these industries and jobs actually be better than what we have currently? And I also think it's a bit of a defeatist attitude, right? It's that we can't really compete on the things that can be done remotely, right? That those things will move offshore, or more importantly, and part of the argument he's making here is not that 40 million jobs are going to go offshore, that they now will face wage competition, right, as we're seeing in the marketplace. Okay, so the industry changes. Which industries will go, which ones will stay, and we get these arguments about whether certain industries matter more than others, and I mentioned the one with semiconductors, of course. We've had this discussion about whether manufacturing matters or not. It's only 10% of GDP, right? 10% of our economy. It's actually 9% of our workforce, and it's been declining over the years on both of those fronts. But there's been a response to manufacturing, that manufacturing matters a lot, and there's been a lot of academic work as well as policy discussions. But it boils down to, in a lot of ways, an innovation argument that, if you look at manufacturing, even though it's 10% of the economy, it's very engineering intensive, right? About 43% of engineers work in manufacturing. 68% of all of our R&D that's spent in the country is done in the manufacturing sector, and about 90% of patents. So if you believe that innovation is the key to economic growth, then manufacturing matters, and this is part of the arguments that are being made there. And I'm setting this up so when we have a discussion later, does IT BPO matter? And how do you craft these arguments of why those industries should get some kind of treatment? Does software matter? What's also new in this round of globalization is that, in fact, if you look what's happening, it's not a simple division of labor, that in fact some R&D is moving offshore. Some innovation is moving offshore. Now, nobody really knows whether that's because China requires that you set up an R&D facility in China in order to take advantage of the 60 cents an hour labor. Okay, that's a quid pro quo. That's a requirement in order to set up your production facilities and whatnot. And whether the content that's coming out of that research is of value. Some people say yes, some people say no. But I think what's more important here is that you've got countries like India and China that realize innovation matters and that they're trying to target some of the R&D. And China, of course, has this indigenous innovation plan. Whether it's successful or not, we'll see. But more importantly, rather than capturing the R&D, what I think it signals is that they have the absorptive capacity to move upskill. Right? So they're building the groundwork, right, in terms of their research enterprise to build up the skills, the higher education capacity and capability to educate those workers to absorb those higher skill jobs rather than just the low skill things. And that points to the policy rationale for why we subsidize R&D. And the purpose of subsidizing R&D is not to create research jobs. There's only about 1 million or so research jobs in the US. The hope is that we have, if we subsidize the research and development, that the downstream design, development, and production jobs remain geographically sticky. And I think that's a real question mark now. I think that, in fact, things could be much more leaky as we see China and India and other countries start to target the higher value jobs. And I think that then puts some question in terms of in the strategies that we've chosen in the U.S. to say we're going to bet on R&D, we're going to bet on innovation, and that's going to be our savior. I know in New York State, as a taxpayer, there's about $1 billion going into Albany to do nanoscience and nanoengineering. IBM is a big beneficiary there. The question is, you hope that the nano breakthrough happens in Albany. The question is whether the design, development, and production, those plants, actually get co-located in Albany, or do they move somewhere else outside the state. The other reason that we subsidize R&D, much to the chagrin of my engineering professor colleagues, is not because of the great research papers that they publish, but it's mostly about there's of course some elite few that do produce very, very good research that makes breakthroughs and startups, but that's a small minority. Much of the work is really about educating students, educating at the graduate level. So we're really subsidizing graduate level education in an indirect way by subsidizing R&D at the universities. There's been a push both in the public discussion and opinion makers, but also within the universities, of startups. Startups is going to be our savior. Right? That we can't rely on large corporations anymore to create jobs. The way we're going to create jobs are startups. Now, I think the actual data here is a little bit more mixed in the way they discuss it, but that startups are what's going to save us. So you've seen Tom Friedman talk about this, and this is actually some quotes, and I'm not going to read it all, out of an op-ed cover story for Business Week that Andy Grove did. So he was the former CEO of Intel. And what he argues is that we have to have a job-centric leadership and incentives to create U.S. domestic employment. And says that this notion that we can just rely on startups is not enough, and really what he points out is that where startups create the jobs is not their initial small company, it's when they scale up. So it's when they actually have a product that's there and they're going to build it to scale and volume. And what he's arguing is that at least in his sector, in electronics and in other sectors, that scaling up process is now being done in much more geographically dispersed ways, right? So it's done offshore, and so we're not gaining from those breakthroughs that we had, right? As a country, at least. The company is going to be successful, but the spillover benefits of subsidizing that innovation, having that startup ecosystem that we have, doesn't actually turn into the payoffs that we normally are used to, okay? Okay, so one of the ways that one makes an argument is to understand sort of the broader context. So I want to talk a little bit about the state of the U.S. labor market, and then I'll get back into the domestic IT, BPO, specific kinds of discussion. So the state of the U.S. labor market, we're in a very odd situation, unprecedented. Okay, and what I'm showing here is the number of, in millions, the number of jobs that were created, net new jobs created per decade. So in 1951, we had 11 million more jobs than we had in 1941, and you can see every decade we had an increase in jobs, net jobs, except for 2001 to 2011. So in the past 7 decades, this is the first decade ever that we actually have less jobs today than we did 10 years ago. Okay. Every one of those decades had recessions and recoveries, right? So we're in a very different situation. I think we're in a very different labor market than people realize, and that even the elites realize. And this is just showing the same graph, but in terms of percentages. And so the Clintonistas love to talk about the 1990s, right? The great job growth that we had in the 90s. The reality is it was pretty average when you look at it in terms of percentage terms right there. I would argue that if you look over the last decade, since 2000, we're actually short quite a significant number of jobs. People say the Great Recession destroyed about 7 or 8 million jobs, but we never actually recovered from that recession of the early 2000s. And so what I've done here, the red line is the actual number of net jobs in the U.S., and then I've extrapolated here the trend line between 1980 and 2000, that's the green line. And I'd argue we're roughly, and this is just an estimate, right, roughly short about 21 million jobs. It's not because we have less people in the U.S. In fact, we have 32 million more people than we did a decade ago. And so my takeaways from this is that the weak job creation predates the Great Recession. We're in a much deeper hole than people realize. It's deeper than the 8 million that were lost in the Great Recession. By the way, we haven't recovered that yet, those 8 million. And you still have population growth. In spite of the baby boomers retiring, you still have a net labor force population increase over this time. We have had current job growth. The latest numbers were 160,000 or so last month, right? Which is barely enough to keep up with population. And if you read between the numbers and then the details, the quality of those jobs is questionable, right? There's a lot of part-time jobs. Are they high-wage jobs, and so on and so forth. And I also point out, during the 2000s, we had incredible amounts of stimulus. So we had stimulus from the policy side in terms of fiscal stimulus. We were fighting 2 wars. And so we were running deficits. We also had a household debt go up very significantly. So the U.S. households took on a significant amount of debt, which puts money into the economy. We had really low interest rates. We've had very low interest rates. And in spite of that, we really haven't had the kind of job growth that one would expect. So there's been some discussion about what causes this weak job creation. So if you read Paul Krugman, the liberal economist who writes for the New York Times, argued that the $800 billion stimulus wasn't enough. It should have been about $1.4 billion or so, or $1.4 trillion or so, and that we're really in a garden variety business cycle. It's a very significant one, but we know what the tools are. Let's have cheap money, right? Low interest rates, but you also need some kind of fiscal stimulus. Then you got folks on the right like Arthur Brooks, who says, no, it's all about government interference, Obamacare, regulations, and those kinds of things. Then you've got another interesting one that's going on about innovation. So you've got Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee at MIT, who have a very small book called The Race Against the Machine, and they argue that innovation is just moving too fast for two things. One, it's destroying a lot of jobs, and so you don't have the right kinds of skills for the new jobs. The second is that entrepreneurs don't know how to use the new technology to create the new jobs in the future. I'm pretty skeptical. There's no modeling here. They just have a few charts in terms of data, so you have to take a few leaps of faith. And then you got Tyler Cohen, who's at George Mason University, who argues that, in fact, there's too little innovation, that we've already harvested all the low-hanging fruit, and that, in fact, that we're just in a sort of a historical cycle where we're not going to create enough innovation to create jobs. I get confused by all of this. I don't know about you. You know, it says he said, she said, what do you do? And then there's no analytic framework for, you know, how do you decide who's right and who's not? So my argument is that I think globalization has had a more significant impact than the typical sort of analyst would agree to. And that we've had a structure structural change in U.S. job creation. And so you hear these, this sort of key word of structural change, and a lot of economists, especially liberal ones, don't like that, right? Because they say it's a business cycle and we had to worry about stimulus and all of those kinds of things. But I think the structure of the labor market has changed quite significantly. We don't have good models for figuring out how it's affected things. We get some clues, and we haven't done the hard work of collecting the data and the empirics behind it. You see some of this coming out. Michael Spence, who's a Nobel laureate, his NYU professor, has a book. David Otter from MIT is a labor economist, has written a little bit about this. And what they say is that globalization has actually hollowed out some of these middle skill jobs, that the demand has leaked offshore, and so they blame globalization to some extent. Okay, so let me drill down now into your sector of, does it matter where IT and BPO services are performed? So one way I like to think about this is thinking about kinds of large projects that go on, and particularly from the government side. This is a picture, this is actually from the New York Times, of a bridge. This is the Bay Bridge, San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge. Was made in China. Right, they shipped it over. This is a major project, obviously, doing a bridge. Now, is that something that, whether it matters or not, whether it's done in the US or in China? Why would China want to get that job? Well, to me, this is a large engineering job. You're building capacity and capabilities and skills. So if you want to be competitive on the next bridge project, you want to have those capabilities in your country. And I think that's what China's doing. It's taking the long run of building up its capabilities and capacity, right? And so I think it does matter where this bridge is built, and contrary to the governator, right, however you pronounce it, it did matter where this happened. And not just because of cost, but also because of what you get out of it in terms of the capabilities and capacities later on. Now this, Martin Luther King Memorial, if you've ever been down there, it's actually quite nice to walk around there. It's a very pleasant memorial. This is also made in China. Does this matter, whether it was made in China or the US? Put aside the sentimental and you know, a lot of people were in an uproar, like how could you do this kind of thing. But just from a skills capability standpoint of building your capacity, you have an idle workforce here, right? I mean, we have 7.3% unemployment. There's a lot of people still underemployed and unemployed. Why wouldn't you put them to work? But is this the kind of project that you build capacity and capability with? I don't know. Then you take it to the extreme and you say, pencils. Should we be domestic sourcing all of our pencils? Does that matter? And I would say no. Right? That's the kind of thing that is a commodity. The skills and capacity in building is not there. You don't get those kinds of spillover benefits. Okay. So let me tell you my take on what policymakers in Washington, particularly in Washington, how they view IT and BPO. Is it important to the U.S.? First, you got to put it in the larger context of what the Washington elite believe. They believe that globalization and offshoring is good for America, and you see this on the left and the right. And so as much as they might make noises about it, in reality they believe that it's good for America. And you see this on the New York Times, which is a liberal paper, in terms of the editorial board, and the Wall Street Journal. This is an area that they agree on. Offshoring is good, and they wrote editorials in favor of it. We've run 3 presidential elections. All have talked about offshoring and outsourcing. Barack Obama, if you remember, in 2012, ran a lot of very negative ads against Mitt Romney based on a couple of Washington Post stories that were a little bit sketchy, attacking him on outsourcing. But the reality is that during Obama's first term, he had Diana Farrell from McKinsey as his number 2 in the National Economic Council. And if anybody knows Diana Farrell, she was the biggest evangelist for offshoring, right? She was making tens of millions of dollars for McKinsey in offshoring and promoting it. And when Obama got elected, that's who he put, right? The brain trust was the Bob Rubinites and whatnot. And they really believe that globalization is good in this version of offshoring. So that's a pretty tough hill to climb to begin with in terms of making the arguments about offshoring and reshoring. The exception has been in manufacturing, and that's been traditional, and that's a few decades old, but much of his talk and discussion about reshoring and insourcing, however you want to call it, has revolved around manufacturing, and he's got a few initiatives, the AMP, the Advanced Manufacturing Plan. There's also academic cover, right? So Willie Shih and Gary Pisano from Harvard Business School have a new book talking about how it's important. And then you've got, of course, the labor union. So you've got some political support and some intellectual support along it. That doesn't mean that there aren't skeptics. So even Obama's own Council of Economic Advisors chair in his first term, Christy Romer, a professor from Berkeley, wrote an op-ed in the New York Times saying manufacturing should not get special treatment, right? So why have we sort of, you've got this discussion going on in manufacturing. You don't have an equivalent discussion going on in IT BPO. And I've followed this for a while, and I've thought it's been kind of interesting. And I think one of the reasons is that the IT industry was early on big evangelizers of offshoring and arguing that it was good. And I would be on panels with Harris Miller from ITAA, and it would be, globalization is great, offshoring's good, and they funded a bunch of studies too that supported that. I think you also have financial services firms that are big clients here who have benefited a lot, and they have not just a world view, but they also have a bottom line view that they are going to save on these kinds of things, and they have a lot of influence in Washington. And then you had the cover from the think tanks and consulting firms, whether it's the Council on Foreign Relations or McKinsey and the like. There's also a perception, and we had a conversation yesterday, and I think it was Josh Flagg was saying, a lot of economic development people are interested. I have the term sexier. He said the shiny new object, right? That IT BPO is kind of a sunset industry. It's not as interesting as video games, I think is the example he gave. The sunrise industries, the bio, nano, 3D printing kinds of things seem sexier and seem to have more promise, right? So there's a perception that IT BPO is somewhat lost, right? That we can't really compete in a significant way there, and so you're going to take your scarce resources and invest it in something that you think will have better payoff. I think also, unlike manufacturing, you don't have worker organizations that represent these workers that are really fighting for this. You see it a little bit in the call centers where there's some unions, CWA that's been involved on the policy side and whatnot, but there's not a significant presence on the worker side. So how does one craft an argument in favor of doing something, in favor of domestic IT BPO services? I'm just starting here, right? I don't have this crafted. This is something you would have to craft along the way, but I threw down some thoughts. Can you make the innovation argument, right? You hear the president, you hear every politician talk about innovation, right? So how do you piggyback on innovation? Is there a way to craft an argument that IT BPO does feed into innovation, and that's going to be the source of economic growth, and it matters for this sector? I don't think you can make the traditional sort of R&D and patent types of measures, right? So you even look at EDS, which is now part of HP. They were the largest of the independent IT services firms, and I write about R&D quite a bit. And they don't do, they never reported on their 10Ks on their annual reports any R&D spending, right? That's a requirement of any publicly traded company is to report their R&D. And if you look at R&D, Accenture, argues that it does about 300 million or so. I mean, so there are some services firms that do R&D, but you're not going to end up on the top 100, right? And in terms of R&D intensity and the like. So I'm not sure how you make those arguments. I think the stronger argument, it doesn't mean that you're not innovative. It's just that you've got to craft a different way of arguing about innovation there. And I think the argument would be around human capital development, right? So a lot of what you do is your personnel get smarter by learning by doing, right? We're working on projects, and then they get to do more sophisticated projects, and then they go off and start a new company, right, because they see opportunities. And so there, I think if you had some case studies that showed that, and that kind of development, I think you can make an argument there. Is the industry critical or strategic? So to what extent can you make the argument that the semiconductor industry made back in the 1980s, and that is that you're critical to either to national security or homeland security? I don't know enough about how to make that argument, but I think you might be able to do something on that in terms of privacy issues. Are you a job creator? Can you create not just jobs, but good quality jobs? And take advantage of the fact that we're in this situation where the labor market's really not working very well, right? And that there's a lot of idle labor out there. And then also that these are upwardly mobile jobs that create career ladders. So can you show that these are jobs that people who are mid-skilled, can progress in? And then you're competing with other countries that are actually trying to target these jobs, right? So that's the competition side of policy, right? So India's not the IT services hub because the Indian government didn't do anything, right? They have a tax holiday, they have software technology parks, and there's active work on the policy side to try to attract that kind of work, right? One other way to look at this is how do you piggyback on this push for STEM? So there's a consensus in Washington that science, technology, and engineering and math matters, and this is going to be our future. I think a lot of this is done at a pretty superficial level in terms of the conversation, but people are convinced that this matters. So is there a way that you can piggyback on that and say that we actually need more IT and CS graduates than chemists? In fact, if you talk to the chemists, their job market sucks right now. And I have a number of chemistry professor friends who will say that to you straight up. So we don't need just STEM, we need the areas where there's actually demand, where there's some growth and growth potential, and that you have the capacity in terms of the supply where the students would go in. And I think you guys get short shrift here. IT occupations are by far the largest of the STEM occupations, by far. Engineering is about 1.8 million or so. IT occupations about 3.5 million. So all engineering, so I'm talking electrical, aerospace, mechanical, you're much larger than all of the engineering. And nobody really knows that because there's no one really talking about that in Washington. And not just in Washington, but even amongst the academic folks. The computer systems design industry is the largest of the IT employers, so as much as we love Google and Facebook and Apple, the reality is the numbers are on the computer system design, right, on the IT services side. These are high-wage jobs, so computer systems analysts, which is the most typical of the IT occupations, and I didn't put software developers who actually make more money. The median wage is $80K. So I think you could craft some arguments around this, and you could use data to bolster it and raise awareness in Washington and elsewhere. So is it possible to change perceptions? I think, yeah, I think it is. I think this is a ripe time that you could change perceptions, not just in Washington, but in the country, that these are good jobs, these are sectors that matter and can create good jobs. So what are some policy options? The problem is not globalization, it's not technology, it's not immigration, it's how we manage these things. So I think one of the silliest things that happened in the public discussion on offshoring was when John Kerry was running in 2004, he had won the Democratic presidential nomination, and he said, the CEOs who outsource are Benedict Arnolds. Okay. Now that's silly for a couple of reasons. One, why would they're not villains, right? What do we do with Benedict Arnold? They're traitors, right? We hang them. Certainly no CEO in this room would want to be called a traitor by one of the presidential, right, major party presidential nominees. The second is you got to make the business case, the economic case, right? You can't just rely on patriotism. That's going to be a very small part of what can go on. That doesn't mean that the president and policymakers can have some moral suasion and make some choices, and they can move the policy needle to some extent. But it's got to be close. You can't rely purely on sort of political favoritism and patronage, right? So it's got to be a combination. Now the problem is that in fact our policies are tilted against you, at least in my take. Maybe you don't believe that. But it's tilted against domestic sourcing, whether it's tax policy, and I won't go into the details here. We could talk at length about this, about the deferring of profits overseas, but you see large multinational corporations that are keeping literally over $1 trillion offshore and fighting for a low tax rate to bring it back because of a quirk back in the 1960s. During the Kennedy administration, we put this tax law in to allow deferral on foreign profits. Immigration policy, I've been involved in this on the H-1B and L-1 visa program. Why are we giving a competitive advantage to firms that are going to undercut American workers, and then also firms that specialize in offshoring? It doesn't make sense that you would use immigration policy in this way, but we have. And again, it wasn't designed that way for those purposes, but those loopholes have been exploited. Education policy, right? I don't think we've made the efforts to invest in the right ways and to frame education policy. Why do we have these jobs? I hear from CEOs all the time. There are these open vacancies, and at the same time you've got all of this idle labor. So why can't we do a better job of matching these things? It doesn't make sense to me, but I don't see people doing that. Maybe at the grassroots level they're doing it, but we're not having that conversation at a higher level. And I think you could use analytics, you guys are the experts on data and analytics and whatnot, where you could leverage that, where you could point to where there's really scale and where there's real skills needs and whatnot. And I can tell you, I work at a private university, a very large one, at 18,000 students. You know, the university people will be responsive if you say that there are these job opportunities and the like. I think we should be making smarter choices about government procurement. This is one policy lever that most governments use. And, you know, again, do you buy pencils offshore? Yeah, probably. But do you buy certain kinds of services that matter, that are advanced skill, that build the capacity? And I'll use an extreme example. We could do research funding. University research funding. We could hire people at Tsinghua. We could hire people at IIT to do that research. But why would you send it to UC Davis instead of IIT? You don't send it to IIT because it's cheaper. You do it at UC Davis because you're expecting that there's going to be spillover benefits to that kind of procurement. And as we think about complex engineering projects, complex services projects, you're building that capacity, and I think we should be having that conversation about government procurement, and it should go beyond just Buy America in terms of the Defense Department type of regulations and rules. So I just have a couple more slides, and then let's go to Q&A. Amrita asked me about the supply issue and to put up a slide, and this is bachelor's degrees from 1991 to 2010 in computer science. And you can see it was pretty flat in the early 90s, and then it took off like crazy, right? More than doubled, 144% increase over a 7-year span. That's a pretty responsive system. Why is that? Well, you had story after story about the dot-com bubble, and that there were, you know, really large opportunities in computer science. Now, this is degrees, not enrollment, right? So there's a 4-year lag time. And when did that peak happen? Well, 2003, 2004, and what was the job market for IT workers back then? It was pretty awful, right? It was the worst tech recession that we had. We had a tech recession in the early 90s, we had a terrible tech recession in the early 2000s, and then what happens? Well, people are responsive to that, to those labor market signals, and you see degrees decline by about 40% or so over that period of time. It's flattened out, and it's actually on the uptick right now if you look at the enrollment numbers, which gives you a leading indicator of what the numbers are. So my point here is that people do respond to labor market signals. There is a rational system. It could be that the labor market signals are distorted in certain ways, and so the question is, how do you get better labor market signals so that those aren't distorted and that we can look ahead and you get those signals out ahead to those students in some way. The other thing I would point out here is that universities are slow-moving objects, right? So there's a mismatch in terms of the frequency and hertz here. You got a fast-moving labor market, you got a slow-moving educational institution who put new curriculum and whatnot. But we're also slow to get rid of people, right? There's something called tenure, which is beautiful to have, let me tell you. And so what happened in the 90s was that they hired a lot of people in computer science faculties who are still around. And so we have the capacity in terms of the faculty and the facilities to increase these numbers back up to where they were in the peak. And so there is an opportunity there in terms of excess capacity. You wouldn't have to be doing a huge amount of hiring on the faculty side, which takes time. And I can tell you, hiring a faculty member takes a whole year. You think you have HR problems? I do too. Okay. And so I think we need this sort of rational discussion about the real needs of the workforce, rather than having, Jeff Immelt and the bigwigs say we need 10,000 more engineers in sort of an abstract way. And by the way, Ursula Burns is CEO of Xerox, and Xerox is big in Rochester. I talked to the line engineers there, I talked to the product development engineers there, and they're laying off like crazy, and she's out there as the number 2 of the Jobs Council saying we need more engineers. There's a huge mismatch between what she's saying sort of publicly of what we need and what's going on the ground. And I actually know the folks, they go to RIT, they went to RIT, and they're telling me it's layoff after layoff, or they're offshoring the work, and so on and so forth. So let's have a real conversation. I think there are real needs, there's real opportunities, but it's got to be separated from the politics, especially around immigration policy, that we just have this STEM workforce crisis, right? That all STEM is a problem. We don't need more life scientists, I can tell you that. We don't need more chemists. We may need more IT services workers, and maybe it's not CS majors, maybe it's MIS majors, right? So I showed the numbers for bachelors in computer science. If you look at MIS, and I haven't pulled up the numbers, but I have some friends who teach, their numbers drop by 80%, and I know my faculty in the business school in MIS, their numbers have not recovered. But I talk to people in the business world, and they say, yeah, we're still trying to hire some MIS people. So I think we need to have this kind of conversation, and IEEE actually has a nice story that's out right now that's generating a lot of buzz. It's the second most widely viewed story in IEEE Spectrum's history, and that's the flagship publication for IEEE. And Bob Charette, who wrote the article, the title is "The STEM Crisis is a Myth." So he tries to go through all the studies that have been done, looking at whether we are actually in a crisis or not. So let me leave it there and open it up for questions. So I think Tess has a microphone if anybody wants to use it. And get in the back there.
Ron, thanks for your comments. I'm Adam Bruns with Site Selection Magazine. I'm curious what you make of some of the kind of big, splashy projects that have landed recently. I'm thinking of GE's Innovation Center in California, and I'm thinking of Cerner Corporation in Kansas City, which on both sides of the state line has announced plans to create 9,000 jobs with big complexes in Kansas City, Kansas, and now a redevelopment of a mall site in Kansas City, Missouri. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with those particular projects. Certainly there's been a lot of buzz and discussion about reshoring, and Apple, for example, doing some of their work onshore. I forget what project was, but Google also with the Motorola Moto X cell phone. The problem I have is that we don't have a scorecard of what's going on, what's going offshore, what's going back and reshored, but more importantly, why, right? So what is it that tilts a decision one way or the other in terms of site selection? And in fact, back in 2007, I was a consultant in the House Science Committee, and I tried to I was holding a number of hearings on these issues, and one of the things we try to understand is why site selection experts and consultants choose one area or another, and your folks were actually very helpful in identifying, I can't remember the witness who came, but that kind of data and information would give you a sense of these are the kinds of jobs where we're pretty close, and a few policy tweaks here and there could make the difference, and then there's other jobs that, it's not even close, right? And it's not worth investing the time and effort on. And maybe IEDC, you economic development folks, do share that kind of data and information in detail, and I'm just not aware of it. But I'm also a little skeptical about the individual announcements like Apple. Is it coincidence that they were just raked over the coals and up on Capitol Hill about their tax, not paying taxes and so on and so forth. So, they're trying to balance things out. Other questions? I wasn't provocative enough? Or you guys are tired?
Eric Hochstein with Nearshore Americas. I'm not sure I have a question as much as a comment and a concern. You've spent a great deal of time in this presentation talking about what I'll call the myths of outsourcing versus the realities of economics and politics or something. And it sounds as if there's a real battle between what's out there politically in buzzwords and campaigns and the public battle, and then the reality that a lot of that isn't real. The STEM crisis may not be true. But how do you battle that? How do you change that in a sense, momentum?
I'd say on a couple of levels, right? So policy making is done on the political side, but there's also elite opinion matters a lot, right? And so you've got to have those ideas. There's a battle of ideas around these kinds of issues. And if no one is speaking out, and you got to do it in a rational way with data and those kinds of things, it's a very tough battle, because especially this is their default position, right? And so Obama's run 2 campaigns on offshoring and outsourcing, right? Attacking in McCain in 2008 and 2012. Once he got elected, Obama hasn't done anything on outsourcing. Why? Because no one's pushing him to do anything, right? So even though you've got an American public that cares about this, and that they care about it, because otherwise Obama's pollsters wouldn't have said run commercials on this issue, right? Unless you have pressure groups, interest groups that are going to fight for doing something, then nothing's going to happen, because the default position and the politically connected are benefiting from it or don't want any kind of change. And so it is an uphill battle. But part of the battle is also in the battle of ideas, right? And you're starting to see some chinks in that armor, where you had Michael Spence, you had Frank Fukuyama, talk about, well, what's happening in the middle skill jobs, what's happening with globalization, is it really benefiting everyone? Do we need to rethink that? Those are slow-moving things, but there's some openings where one could make a change. The other thing I would say is, I had some friends in the House Science Committee, which is one of the standing committees in the House of Representatives, and they were very interested in these issues, especially outsourcing. And this is in 2005 or so, and I said, why don't the Democrats run on outsourcing? And why don't they hold hearings, and why don't they make speeches and things like that? Take advantage of what the public thinks about all of this. And so what the staffer, who was a very senior guy, very savvy guy, said to me, he said, the minute a politician gets up and talks about it, the first question from the press is going to be, so what are you going to do about it? What's your solution? So part of what needs to be done is not to point out just a problem, but to say, here are some of the solutions that can be done, and these are actionable items, and it's doable, and so on and so forth. So that's a part of crafting. If you want a policy response, that's part of crafting it. Of course, part of what I think you want to do is also change the discussion so that students and the private decision makers are making decisions that are, that are in your favor. And they may not be. Other questions or comments? He's gone.
So Ron, quick question in terms of that solution, I guess. Would Washington not say that they have the solution for that, and it's the easy button of I can turn up the H-1Bs and down in conjunction or in sync with the labor market?
Well, there's a whole set of politics around that, right, around the H-1B. So the part of the whole STEM crisis is built around arguments on immigration policy, and I don't think we've had sort of a fair discussion about where there's real needs, right? So you end up with people saying there's a dire shortage in order to justify higher H-1B numbers. And in reality, of course, the top users of the H-1B program are offshore outsourcing firms. And they're using it for wage arbitrage. And we know that. I have the data. I can show all that. You all know that, right? But people in Washington and people at the Wall Street Journal don't always know it. So you have to have someone keep repeating this over and over again. So I think part of it is, contrasting, and I'll use the semiconductor industry, contrasting the Andy Grove op-ed where he was really concerned. And he was part of the competitiveness debate in the 1980s. Intel was worried, they got out of the memory business because they couldn't compete there, even though they invented a lot of the memory stuff. They went to Washington looking for help. You had a different generation of CEO back then, where the interests were much more aligned. And it wasn't just the industry, it was also the semiconductor industry. This time around, in 2002, 2003, one of the most vocal CEOs was Craig Barrett, who was Intel CEO at the time, and his message was very clear, and they controlled a lot of the process, and I could go into gory details about how Washington works and the Ideas Factory. But the upshot of it was do no harm, don't do anything. The status quo is just fine. And that was the message that came out, and the way they crafted it was they gave the solution to the problem to take the problem off the table. So the best way to take a problem off the table, problem is globalization. The solution that Craig Barrett and Carly Fiorina came up with, and Norm Augustine came up with, the Grand Poobahs came up with was, we have a shortage of engineers, we need more of them, so we need to increase the number that the U.S. is producing. We need to increase the number of immigrants, H-1Bs, guest workers. We also have a deficit in terms of R&D spending, so the government should spend more money on R&D. And our K-12 education system stinks. That's the whipping boy of everybody loves to whip the K-12 education system. And so if we just invest this, we'll solve it. Now, the reality of that, of course, is all of that is taxpayer money, right? Intel takes no responsibility there. HP, Carly Fiorina, didn't take any responsibility over what was going on. And so it was very clever, and it was very concerted through the Council on Competitiveness, through the National Academies, a number of different nonprofit organizations that got out ahead of it. And you take a problem off the table by saying, here's the solution. And so there was a report you might have heard of called Rising Above the Gathering Storm that laid all of this out. I was a reviewer of that, and of course I was quite critical, but the way National Academies work is they can ignore the reviewer's comment. So what I'm saying also, though, I think, is that there are some opportunities. People are starting to question, right? There's a very famous book, if you ever go to graduate school in social sciences, called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. And it goes through how did we have these revolutions in terms of physics over the years in scientific revolutions. So there's vested interest in terms of a mental model and framework of how things work. But when you have enough anomalies and you get the next generation of thinkers coming in, they can overturn what's there, because there's enough anomalies to say, wait a second, things aren't adding up. And I think you're starting to see pieces of that, but there's no organized interest trying to push that through. So that's kind of a long answer, but.
Hey Ron, thanks a lot for a pretty insightful talk here. Just a quick, maybe a comment and a question. So I was with both Motorola and GE for several years, okay? So at a company level, the need for global growth and cost reduction drove to the models that the industry ended up with, right? So I guess both government policy and the dynamics of how the markets evolve will play an important role in the next phase of how this is going to work out. So the question is, how do you balance these, and what kind of a framework, maybe you have thought that would be the key to this? Because I don't know whether this is a black and white answer, right? Because this is pretty dynamic and it's very global, and there are positives and obviously there are challenges. And I think we have seen the 2001 to 2011 that you showed were very stark. The loss of job growth in the US was I think a tremendous red flag, and that is absolutely not the right future for our industry. So given that, but given the other dynamics. So just thinking if there was a framework that you are thinking beyond what you presented.
So I think there's a lot of different, there's no one silver bullet, right? We've got to respond to not only globalization, but also how employment has changed and how companies, so the rise of shareholder value, right? So some people say, look, the way we need to solve these problems is by changing corporate governance so that we have more of a stakeholder model rather than a pure shareholder model, right? I've never tried to go in that direction, but a number of people say that that's the key. A number of other people say it's all about campaign finance reform. But what I would point about globalization, it's not the problem, right? It's how we respond and who benefits from globalization. And so Jeff Immelt, CEO of GE, loves to say, look, 95% of the world's customers are outside the US, and they're growing, and this is going to be great for American workers because they can benefit from so many more consumers and customers of their products and services. So I say that's great. Well, China's been growing 9%, if you believe their numbers. India until recently was growing 7%. You've got hundreds of millions, and there's a great thing, right? I mean, my cousins in India are doing much better than they would have without outsourcing. You've got this huge growth, and then look at what's happened to the U.S. workforce and the labor market, right, and labor demand. So does Jeff Immelt, do other people who argue that the growth of China and India is going to drive demand for labor, not demand for GE products, but demand for American labor. What's going to change? What's going to be different? Is it that they're going to grow faster? Are they going to demand different products? I don't know, but it's not clear to me that at least this don't worry, be happy approach is the right way. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but you know, these are complex things and we shouldn't be afraid, we shouldn't hunker down, but I think we should make some changes in policy and lots of different policies, right? This cuts across all kinds of education, trade, all of those things. IP.
Hello, Ron. Brian Bradley, SoftTech. Just wanted to ask you, with some of the business models out there related to offshore and nearshore model, are some of the same conversations occurring as it relates to a nearshore model? So certainly with a lot of organizations and the NAFTA agreement, more organizations are, you know, pushing towards a nearshore model and even doing hybrid models with the, you know, domestic sourcing and the nearshore model. Mm-hmm. With some of the graphs that you showed in terms of trends, what kind of conversations are occurring there? I'm just curious.
So I can't say that, so I'm not an expert on your business models and which ones are going to be more competitive than others and in which types of markets and whatnot. Certainly geopolitical considerations come into these kinds of policy choices. So the U.S. Trade Representative and NAFTA and those kinds of trade agreements, there's a view of how we should approach nearshore or offshore, you know, our WTO obligations, those kinds of things, that may be counter to what perhaps some people think would be good for America in terms of the American interests. So the policymaking process can be pretty complicated, but I can't speak to the business side of whether nearshore is more competitive or domestic sourcing versus somewhere afar. There's other people in the room, I think, who are much better at that than I. Was that what you were getting at, or did I miss it?
No, I was just trying to see from your perspective and analysis, talking about offshore, curious if your study or some research that you brought together, you think you can speak to in relation to that?
Well, you know, I think there's always been this notion of trade as aid, right? And part of our problems, especially in the South and in terms of Mexico, that through economic integration we can have, you know, better spillover benefits in terms of less push for undocumented workers to come across, right? So there's always been a discussion about how do you develop Mexico in particular, and then also those geopolitical considerations of having allies and whatnot come into play with not just the trade agreements, but many other policy factors and whatnot. You see this in terms of the immigration policy debate right now, where India sees its angle as coming through a trade and protectionism type of argument that any kind of constraints on the H-1B program are going to be in violation of the WTO. I don't think that's true, but that's one of the angles they're trying to take. Okay, I think I'm out of time, so thank you very much. I appreciate your time.